Inside Pelican Bay State Prison. For decades, men have been brought here and quietly erased from the outside world. No sirens. No crowds. Just a long drive north, a set of steel gates, and a promise made without words: once inside, nothing will ever be the same. This is not a place built to rehabilitate. It was built to endure, longer than anger, longer than hope, longer than time itself. And for those who live here, the worst part isn't the violence. It's the silence that comes after. This is Pelican Bay State Prison, a facility designed to hold the state's most dangerous and disruptive inmates. But what actually happens once the doors close behind you is rarely seen, and even less understood. To grasp it, you have to start with why this prison exists at all. Why Pelican Bay was built. Pelican Bay was born from fear. In the late 1980s, California's prison system was spiraling. Overcrowding was severe, gangs were consolidating power behind bars, and administrators believed traditional prisons could no longer contain the violence. Riots, stabbings, and coordinated assaults were becoming harder to control. The solution, at least on paper, was radical isolation. Instead of dispersing gang leaders across the system, the state chose to concentrate them in one place. A prison so remote that escape would be nearly impossible. So controlled that communication could be reduced to nothing. Pelican Bay opened in 1989 with a clear purpose: permanent containment. What made it different wasn't just where it was built, but how it was designed to function. Every corridor, every door, every wall was engineered around one idea: control through separation. And nowhere inside the prison embodies that idea more than a section few outsiders ever see. The SHU. The Security Housing Unit, known simply as the SHU, is the heart of Pelican Bay's reputation. This is where inmates deemed the most dangerous are housed, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. A typical SHU cell measures roughly 8 by 10 feet. Concrete walls. A concrete bed. A steel toilet sink combination welded into the wall. There are no bars, only a solid metal door with a small slot. The window, if it can be called that, is a narrow frosted pane that allows light in but reveals nothing of the world outside. In here, days blur together. Lights are controlled externally. Meals arrive through the slot. Voices echo down the tier, but faces are rarely seen. The official goal is safety. Fewer interactions mean fewer assaults. But over time, isolation becomes something else entirely. Some men enter the SHU believing they can outlast it. Others realize quickly that this place does not operate on normal timelines. Months stretch into years. Years dissolve into something harder to measure. And what happens to the mind when human contact is reduced to seconds a day? That question follows everything that comes next. A day that never changes. A day in Pelican Bay begins without sunrise. In the SHU, inmates don't wake to light or sound, they wake because they've learned to. Morning meals are delivered early. A tray slides through the slot. No words are exchanged. If you don't take it quickly enough, it's gone. That's not punishment, it's routine. After breakfast, hours pass in silence. There is no work assignment. No education program. No group activity. Time is filled with pacing, push-ups, reading whatever materials are allowed, or simply lying still. For many, the most anticipated moment of the day is exercise, but even that is unlike anything most people imagine. The yard without a yard. In Pelican Bay's SHU, exercise takes place alone. Inmates are escorted, one at a time, to small concrete enclosures often described as dog runs. The walls are high enough to block any view of the horizon. The floor is bare concrete. The sky is visible only if you look straight up. You are given roughly 90 minutes. No equipment. No interaction. Just space to walk in circles. Some men pace relentlessly, counting steps to stay anchored in reality. Others stand still, letting the sun hit their face, reminding themselves the outside world still exists somewhere above. When time is up, cuffs are reapplied, and the door closes again. What happens next is rarely documented, but it shapes everything about survival inside this prison. Power without contact. Pelican Bay was designed to eliminate gang influence. Instead, it forced it to evolve. With no physical contact, communication adapted. Messages were passed through plumbing pipes, shouted through vents, or encoded in seemingly meaningless actions. Entire command structures existed without leaders ever seeing the people they controlled. Race became a primary organizing principle. Not always out of ideology, but necessity. Protection, retaliation, and discipline all followed rigid lines. Breaking them could mean consequences that reached far beyond a single cell. This was the paradox of Pelican Bay: even in extreme isolation, systems of power still formed. And if you were labeled a threat, rightly or wrongly, you could find yourself trapped in this environment with no clear path out. Getting in is easy. Getting out is not. Placement in the SHU did not require a criminal conviction. In many cases, it was based on intelligence, alleged gang affiliation, possession of certain artwork, or information from confidential informants. Once assigned, release was not automatic. For years, the primary way out was a process known as debriefing. That meant providing information about gang activity, names, structures, operations. For some, this was impossible. For others, it was dangerous. Refusing to debrief could mean indefinite isolation. Agreeing could put lives at risk elsewhere in the system. It was a choice with no safe outcome. And as the years passed, the psychological cost became impossible to ignore. The quiet damage. Extended isolation doesn't leave visible scars, but its effects are profound. Former inmates have described losing the ability to concentrate, to sleep, to hold conversations. Some experienced paranoia. Others reported memory loss or emotional numbness. Time, when stripped of events, becomes disorienting. Weeks vanish. Years compress. The outside world starts to feel unreal. This is where Pelican Bay's story began to change, not because of what happened inside the walls, but because of what reached the courts. Voices that couldn't be ignored. For years, what happened inside Pelican Bay stayed inside Pelican Bay. Complaints rarely made it past internal reviews. Grievances disappeared into filing cabinets. But eventually, the isolation that defined the prison created something administrators did not expect: unity among men who were never meant to work together. From separate cells, across racial and organizational lines, inmates began coordinating legal challenges. They shared case law through coded conversations and passed arguments through informal channels. Their claim was simple but dangerous to the system: prolonged solitary confinement was not just harsh, it was damaging in ways the Constitution did not allow. One lawsuit became many. Testimonies described years without human touch, decades without meaningful conversation, and psychological harm that continued long after release from isolation. The state pushed back. Officials argued that Pelican Bay prevented violence across the entire prison system. That without this level of control, chaos would return. But the evidence was mounting. And the pressure was growing. The hunger strikes. In 2011, something unprecedented happened. Inmates across Pelican Bay refused to eat. The hunger strike was not chaotic or impulsive. It was organized, deliberate, and sustained. Participants demanded basic changes: limits on indefinite isolation, access to programming, and an end to policies that kept men in the SHU based on unverified accusations. As days passed, the strike spread beyond Pelican Bay. Other prisons joined. Thousands of inmates across California participated in solidarity. Inside Pelican Bay, the response was controlled but tense. Medical staff monitored declining health. Guards continued routines. The silence grew heavier. What made the strike powerful wasn't just the refusal of food, it was discipline. The same self-control that had been used to survive isolation was now being used to challenge it. And the state was forced to respond. Cracks in the system. Legal scrutiny intensified. Judges examined how long inmates were held in isolation and why. Testimony revealed men who had spent 10, 15, even 20 years in the SHU without a single disciplinary infraction. Public awareness grew. Advocacy groups began paying attention. For the first time, Pelican Bay was being discussed not as a solution, but as a problem. Eventually, settlements were reached. Policies changed. Indefinite SHU confinement was restricted. Many inmates were transferred out of isolation units and into general population or step-down programs. But change did not erase the past. For those who had spent decades in near-total isolation, freedom inside prison came with its own challenges. Life after the SHU. Leaving the SHU was not a return to normal life. It was a collision. Suddenly, there were voices everywhere. Crowded spaces. Unpredictable interactions. Men who had lived in silence found themselves overwhelmed by noise and motion. Some struggled to make eye contact. Others reacted aggressively to minor confrontations. The habits that kept them safe in isolation didn't translate outside it. And yet, for many, it was still better than the cell. Pelican Bay had reshaped them, not always in ways that could be undone. The prison today. Today, Pelican Bay still stands. The walls are the same. The geography hasn't changed. But the way isolation is used has been altered. The SHU no longer holds men indefinitely under the same rules it once did. Oversight exists where secrecy once thrived. And yet, the prison remains one of the most secure facilities in the country. It continues to house individuals considered too dangerous for other prisons. The question is no longer whether Pelican Bay works, but at what cost. What Pelican Bay reveals. Pelican Bay was built on the belief that extreme isolation could control extreme behavior. In some ways, it succeeded. Violence inside the facility was limited. Escapes were non-existent. But the human cost forced a reckoning. What happens when control becomes permanent? When safety is achieved by removing everything that makes someone human? Those questions do not end at Pelican Bay's gates. They echo across prison systems everywhere. And for the men who lived through its most severe years, the prison never truly let them go. The silence that remains. Pelican Bay does not shout its story. It doesn't need to. Its legacy lives in what it took away: time, voices, connection, and in what it revealed about the limits of punishment. Behind these walls, the silence was intentional, engineered, enforced. And long after the doors open, that silence follows the men who endured it. Because some places are not meant to be remembered, but forgetting them comes at an even greater cost. The men behind the doors. To understand Pelican Bay beyond policies and lawsuits, you have to understand the men who lived inside it. Not names or crimes, but patterns. Many arrived young, some in their early 20s, already marked as threats long before they understood what that label would mean here. Some had reputations that followed them north from other prisons. Others were identified through paperwork alone. Tattoos. Drawings. A book found in a cell. A rumor passed along by someone trying to shorten their own time in isolation. Once inside the SHU, identity hardened. You were no longer who you were on the street, or even who you had been in another prison. You became a classification. A risk level. A problem to be managed. And the longer you stayed, the harder it became to remember anything else. Time as a weapon. In Pelican Bay, time was not just something that passed. It was something used. Days were deliberately stripped of distinction. No holidays. No weekends. No meaningful markers. Even seasons were hard to detect from inside a concrete box. Some men tried to fight this by creating routines. Push-ups at the same hour. Reading at the same time each day. Writing letters, even when no one wrote back. Others gave up on tracking time altogether. When every day looks identical, memory begins to collapse in on itself. Events lose order. The past feels unreal. The future stops forming. This wasn't accidental. Predictability reduced conflict. And a man who loses his sense of time is easier to control. But control has consequences. The rules you learn without being taught. Survival at Pelican Bay depended on rules that were never written down. You did not ask questions unless necessary. You did not show weakness, but you also did not draw attention. You learned when to speak through the door and when silence was safer. If someone yelled down the tier, you listened. Not to respond, but to understand what was shifting. Changes in tone mattered. Sudden quiet mattered more. You learned how to stand for cuffing without hesitation. How to face the wall just enough to avoid being accused of resistance. How to keep your body language neutral, even when your mind wasn't. Small mistakes carried consequences. A delay. A wrong look. A misunderstood movement. And discipline, when it came, was absolute. Punishment inside punishment. Even within isolation, there were deeper levels. If an inmate was accused of misconduct inside the SHU, refusing orders, damaging property, or threatening staff, the response could mean further restrictions. Fewer showers. Reduced property. Temporary loss of exercise. The message was clear: there was always something left to take away. This layered punishment created a constant low-level fear. Not of violence, but of erosion. Each privilege lost made the cell feel smaller. Each restriction tightened the psychological pressure. For some, this broke compliance. For others, it broke something else entirely. Mental health on the edge. Mental health treatment existed at Pelican Bay, but it operated under limits shaped by security concerns. Therapy often happened through doors. Conversations were brief, clinical, and monitored. Medications were distributed without discussion. Follow-ups were inconsistent. Some inmates deteriorated quietly. Others acted out, not from aggression, but desperation. Self-harm incidents increased during prolonged isolation, though details rarely became public. The system struggled with a contradiction it could not resolve: how to treat psychological damage caused by the very conditions it enforced. And when inmates were released from the SHU into other prisons, or into society, the damage didn't stay behind. Release without preparation. For some men, the first time they touched another human being after years of isolation was during transport out of Pelican Bay. There was no gradual reintroduction to normal social life. No extensive preparation. One day, the door opened. Cuffs went on. And the world suddenly expanded faster than they could process. Noise became overwhelming. Crowds felt threatening. Simple interactions triggered anxiety or aggression. These men were often labeled difficult or non-compliant in their new environments, without recognition of what they had endured. Pelican Bay had trained them for isolation. Nothing else. The guard's perspective. To understand Pelican Bay fully, you also have to understand those who worked there. Correctional officers were trained to maintain distance. Emotional detachment was not just encouraged, it was necessary. Familiarity could be dangerous. Empathy could be mistaken for weakness. Many officers worked long shifts in a facility surrounded by isolation, geographic and psychological. Burnout was common. Turnover was steady. Some believed deeply in the mission. Others simply followed procedures. Most existed somewhere in between. The system shaped them too. A prison that changed policy. Pelican Bay did more than house inmates. It reshaped prison policy nationwide. The legal battles surrounding its use of solitary confinement influenced reforms in other states. Time limits were introduced. Oversight increased. Alternatives were explored. But Pelican Bay remains a reference point, a warning and a template at the same time. Because no matter how policies shift, the underlying question remains unresolved. What is control worth? Pelican Bay succeeded in one measurable way: it maintained order. But order came through removal, of contact, of choice, of time itself. The cost was paid quietly, cell by cell, year by year. This prison forces an uncomfortable reflection. Not just about crime, but about punishment. About how far a society is willing to go to feel secure. And whether safety achieved through isolation creates consequences that last far longer than any sentence. The place that doesn't let go. Pelican Bay was designed to be forgotten. Built far from cities. Hidden by forest and fog. Sealed behind layers of concrete and steel. But forgetting it is impossible. Because its impact lives on, in policies, in courtrooms, and in the minds of the men who passed through its doors. Some places exist not to be seen, but to test the limits of what we accept. Pelican Bay is one of them. And the silence it perfected still echoes. Pelican Bay was never just a prison. It was an experiment in absolute control, carried out far from public view. For some, it prevented violence. For others, it took something that could never be returned: time lived without human connection. Long after policies changed and cells emptied, the question it raised still lingers: how much isolation is too much, and who gets to decide? Because places like this don't end when the sentence does. They follow people. They follow systems. And they force us to confront what punishment is really meant to do. The walls of Pelican Bay still stand, silent and unmoving. But the story it tells is unfinished, because it's not only about the men who were locked inside. It's about what we choose to build, and what we choose to accept, in the name of control. Thanks for watching Life Behind Bars.